Corporal James Elwood Carter had been standing in line at the Millbrook Pharmacy for 11 minutes. He was not impatient. He had stood at attention in situations that made an 11-minute wait feel like a conversation. He had stood in formation in the rain at Fort Bragg and in the heat at Camp Lejeune, and in the specific kind of cold that came off the water at Parris Island when the wind decided to make its point. He had enlisted at 18. His father had not argued. His father had looked at him across the kitchen table on the Tuesday evening. James told him, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "You've decided." James said, "Yes, sir." Preston said, "Then do it right." That was the whole conversation. His mother had said more. His mother was Louise, and she said what needed to be said when Preston's approach ran short of what the moment required. She had come to his room that night and sat in the chair by the window. She had said, "I want to tell you something about what you're going to face out there." He had said, "Yes, ma'am." She had said, "You're going to face things that are unfair, things that have nothing to do with your ability or your effort or your character. You're going to face them in the Corps, and you're going to face them when you come home, and you're going to face them your whole life." He had said, "I know that, Mama." She had said, "I know you know it. I'm telling you this, the way you handle those things is going to define who you are more than anything else. Not the things themselves, how you handle them." He had thought about that for a long time. He still thought about it. He had thought about it in every situation over 47 years where something unfair had been done to him or around him and he had needed to decide how to respond. He had always come back to the same answer. The answer was in what he had built. The answer was in how he had responded. The answer was in the record. He had handled the pharmacy the way Louise had described 47 years ago, standing in his room in the house on Sycamore Street. He had handled it the way a Carter handled it. He did it right. He had gone to Parris Island and come out the other side with the specific look that people who had been through basic training had, which was not the look of having been broken, but of having been formed. He had served in 3 different commands over 31 years. He had served at Camp Lejeune and at Camp Pendleton and overseas in 2 deployments. He had risen to corporal, and then to staff sergeant, and then through a combination of performance and the kind of service reputation that took decades to build, to master gunnery sergeant before he retired. He had served in 3 different commands. Each one had been different, and each one had required him to be the same thing he had decided to be in year 1. He had learned early that the Corps did not make exceptions for inconsistency. You were what you were every day, or you were not the thing you said you were. He had decided what he was. He had been it every day. He had supervised junior enlisted personnel across 3 separate deployments and 2 stateside commands. He had written 27 letters of commendation for personnel under his command. He had written 6 adverse reports. He had written every one of them the same way, completely accurately, and without comfort to either party. He had been asked once by a young corporal why he bothered writing the commendations when the system often filed them without anyone seeing them. He had said because the person who earned it deserves to have it in the record. The record matters even when nobody looks at it. It matters because when they do look, it's there. The corporal had thought about that. He had written more commendations himself after that conversation. James had watched that happen. He had watched the habit spread the way good habits spread when someone in authority demonstrated them consistently and without requiring acknowledgement. He had thought that's how it works. You do it right, someone watches you. They do it right. The next person watches them. The unit gets better because of something that passed from person to person without any of them having to explain why it mattered. He had carried that principle home from the Corps in 2008. He had carried it into the Deacons Committee. He had carried it into the Saturday breakfasts with Amara. He had carried it into a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon, and he had stood in it the whole time. He had received the Good Conduct Medal twice. He had received the National Defense Service Medal. He had received the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal. He had received the Armed Forces Reserve Medal. He had served with honor in every assignment he had ever been given. He had received a commendation from his commanding officer in his final year for a training program he had developed and run for 8 consecutive years, a program that prepared junior enlisted personnel for the specific combination of physical and mental demands that the command faced. The commendation was signed by Colonel Margaret Sayers, who had been at Camp Lejeune for 14 years and who had a reputation for commendations that were specific and verifiable rather than ceremonial. She had written Master Gunnery Sergeant Carter's program has measurably improved unit readiness across 3 consecutive evaluation cycles. The program's effectiveness lies in its precision. It prepares personnel for what they will actually face, rather than what is convenient to train. This is the standard. This is what we are commending. James had read that commendation standing in the parking lot of the base building where the ceremony was held. He had read it standing up because he had not been ready to sit down yet. He had put it in his jacket pocket and kept it there for the drive home. He had shown it to Mattie at the kitchen table. She had read it. She had looked at him. She had said she got you right. He had said she got it right. She had said same thing. He had framed it. It was on the wall in the study beside the photograph of him and Preston in front of the house on the day James left for Parris Island. He looked at both of them sometimes when he was at the desk. He thought Preston built the thing I grew from. I built the thing the next ones grew from. That was the job. That was what it had always been. He had run the program because he had seen younger Marines come up without sufficient preparation, and he had thought he could fix that. And he had fixed it. He had built the program from a proposal he wrote on a Sunday afternoon and submitted through proper channels on Monday, and the response came back Thursday with an approval and a date. He had learned that if you saw something that needed doing, you wrote the proposal and submitted it through proper channels. He had learned that from his father. Preston had done the same thing at the mill. The Carters were not complainers. They were proposers. He had learned patience at age 18 in the United States Marine Corps, and he had kept it through 31 years of service and through the 16 years since he had come home. He was 65 years old. He was wearing his Marine Corps cap, the one he had received in 2007 at the Veterans Recognition Ceremony, not a store-bought replica, but the actual cap that had been part of the ceremony, and he wore it the way he wore everything that had been earned. He was wearing a button-down shirt, white the collar straight. He was wearing the kind of slacks his late wife Mattie had always called his good ones. His good ones meant she had pressed them. It meant she had run the iron over the crease 3 times until it was exactly what she wanted. It meant she had hung them on the specific hanger in the specific place in the closet. Mattie had passed 4 years ago. Her name had been Mattie Louise Carter, born Mattie Louise Sims, and she had been the person who made the house a house and the life a life from the day they married in 1984 until the day she was gone. James had met her at a church social the summer he was home on leave after his first deployment. She had been standing near the lemonade table talking to her cousin, and she had been wearing a yellow dress. He had seen the yellow dress, and he had walked over there with no plan at all, which was completely unlike him. And he had introduced himself, and she had looked at him with the look she would use for the rest of their lives, that said she already knew more about what he was thinking than he had intended to tell her. She said, "You're Preston Carter's boy." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Your mother coaches the track girls." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You don't have to ma'am me. We're the same age." He said, "I'm not sure about that." She had smiled. He had married her the following year on a Saturday in April. Preston had pressed his good slacks for the wedding. Louise had made the reception cake. He and Mattie had 2 children. Their daughter Renee was 40 years old now and lived in Charlotte with her husband and 2 kids. Their son Marcus was 38 and lived in Grayfield, 6 blocks from the house James still lived in. Marcus had 3 kids. Amara was the oldest of the 5 grandchildren. Mattie had met all 5 of them. She had been at every birth. She had knitted blankets for each one. She had knitted Amara's blanket in yellow because Amara had been born in April, and Mattie said April was a yellow month. The blanket was still on Amara's bed. She used it. James knew because he had been in her room and seen it. The slacks were still pressed. He pressed them himself now. He had watched her do it enough times to know the technique. He pressed the crease 3 times. He used the same iron. He hung them on the same hanger. It was one of the things he had kept because it was something she had cared about, and he had found in the years since she was gone that doing the things she cared about gave the days a shape that the days needed. The days needed a shape. He knew this with the same certainty he knew how to press the crease. He had learned it from watching a woman who understood what gave a life its form. 31 years in the Marine Corps left specific marks. Some were visible. The scar on his right forearm from a training exercise at Camp Lejeune in 1989. The slight forward lean he had developed from decades of carrying gear that a body adjusted to and then could not fully unadjust from. Some were not visible. The nerve pain in his left leg had started in year 22. He had managed it. He had managed it the way Marines managed things that were manageable, which was without complaint, and with the specific discipline of not letting the thing that hurt interfere with the thing that needed doing. He had managed it for 9 years before he retired. He had managed it for 7 more years after. He had mentioned it to Dr. Chen at the VA because she had asked the right question in the right way, and because by that point he had decided that 65-year-old men with 4 in the morning nerve pain were allowed to use the medical system they had earned. He was at the pharmacy to pick up 2 prescriptions. The first was for the blood pressure medication he had been on for 8 years. The second was for the nerve pain medication his VA doctor had adjusted 3 months ago after James had mentioned carefully and with appropriate minimization that the nerve pain in his left leg was waking him up at 4 in the morning on a regular basis. His VA doctor was a woman named Dr. Chen, who had been working with veterans for 20 years and who had learned to translate careful minimization into actual severity. She had adjusted the medication. She had also referred him to a physical therapist named Marcus who worked at the VA's outpatient clinic on Tuesdays and Thursdays. James had been seeing Marcus for 6 weeks. Marcus was 29 years old and had the specific quality of physical therapists who understood that they were working on bodies that had been through things the textbook discussed but had not experienced. He asked James what the pain felt like. He listened to the answer. He adjusted. James was at the pharmacy because Dr. Chen had sent the prescriptions directly to Millbrook after the VA pharmacy had a backlog that put his refill 2 weeks out. He had been to Millbrook twice before for the same reason. Both times he had walked in, gotten in line, picked up the prescriptions, exchanged a few words with Denise about the VA system and about how the nerve pain medication was working and left. Both times it had taken less than 15 minutes. He had no reason to expect this time to be different. He stood in line. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been taught to wait by the Marine Corps, and by his father, and by 31 years of situations that required you to hold your position until the situation resolved. He had also learned that waiting was not the same as accepting. You waited with full attention. You did not stop observing. You kept your mind clear. He stood in the pharmacy line at 3:32 in the afternoon, and he waited with full attention. The pharmacy was on the main floor of a Millbrook health center in the town of Grayfield, which was the town James had grown up in and come back to after his last deployment and settled in with Mattie and raised their 2 children and watched their grandchildren come into the world. He had grown up on Sycamore Street 3 blocks from the high school. His father had worked at the mill east of town for 35 years. Preston Carter had worked the morning shift his entire career. He had never missed a shift in 35 years except for the week he was in the hospital in 1971 with pneumonia and the 2 days after James's mother had her gallbladder out. He had gone back the day after his wife came home from the hospital. She had told him to go. He had gone. That was the Carter way. You went. James's mother, Louise, had worked at the school cafeteria and coached the girls' track team for 16 years until the school consolidated with the one 2 towns over. Louise had a gift for coaching the girls who had decided they couldn't. She had an instinct for finding the particular thing a girl believed she couldn't do and then building the training schedule around proving it to her. 7 of the girls she coached had gone to state. 2 had gotten track scholarships. She still got Christmas cards from 3 of them, or she had until she passed. Preston had gone first in 2013. Louise had gone in 2016. James had buried both of them from the same church. James had buried all 3 of them from the same church, the Second Baptist Church on Callaway Avenue, which his grandmother had helped found in 1946 when the other Baptist church in town had made its position clear about who it considered members. He was a deacon at Second Baptist now. He had been a deacon for 12 years. The role required things he was glad to give. It required showing up. It required being reliable in the way that people could count on without having to ask. It required the specific combination of patience and firmness that he had built in the Marines, and that translated into civilian life more directly than people sometimes expected. He had served as the chair of the Deacons Finance Committee for 9 of his 12 years. He had served on the Pastoral Search Committee when the previous reverend retired. He had served on the Emergency Deacon Response Team, which was the team that went to parishioners in crisis, the ones who were sick or had lost someone or had hit a situation they could not navigate alone. He was a man who showed up. He had been showing up since he was 18 years old. He was a man who took things seriously. He had been that way before the Marines, and the Marines had confirmed it rather than created it. The prescription counter at Millbrook Pharmacy was staffed that afternoon by a pharmacist named Denise Holloway and a pharmacy technician named Robert. Denise had been at Millbrook for 9 years. She knew James Carter. He had been coming in for 2 years since the VA backlog issue, and in those 2 years, she had come to know that he always had his insurance card ready and always knew the names of his medications and always thanked her by name. She was preparing his prescriptions when the situation at the front of the pharmacy began. The situation began because of a man named Officer Dale Hutchins. Hutchins was 41 years old. He was a loss prevention officer contracted to Millbrook Health Center. He worked the daytime floor, and his responsibilities included monitoring for shoplifting, responding to spills and incidents, and what he described internally as maintaining the atmosphere of the retail floor. Maintaining the atmosphere was not an official category in his job description. It was a category he had created himself. He had been watching James Carter for approximately 4 minutes before he walked over. He had been watching because James had walked in from the main entrance, gone directly to the pharmacy counter, taken his place in line, and stood there with his hands in his pockets. Hutchins had watched that. He had watched a man stand quietly in a line at a pharmacy. In 4 minutes, he had watched James Carter stand still, keep his hands in his pockets, look at the counter, and not approach any merchandise section. He had watched a man wait. He had decided that the man did not belong. He had not been able to articulate what it was that made him decide that. He would not be able to articulate it later in Sandra Okafor's office when she asked him directly. He would say there were reports. She would say from who. He would not have an answer. He walked over. He said, "Sir, I need to speak with you." James looked at him. He said, "About what?" Hutchins said, "We've had some reports of merchandise being taken in this section. I need to ask you a few questions." James said, "I haven't taken anything. I'm in line to pick up my prescriptions." Hutchins said, "I understand. Can I ask you to step to the side while I verify that?" James said, "I've been standing in this line for 11 minutes. My name is James Carter. My prescriptions are being filled. The pharmacist will confirm it." He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way he said things when the information was complete and he expected the information to be sufficient. Hutchins said, "I still need you to step to the side." James said, "You need to go ask the pharmacist." Hutchins said, "Sir." He put his hand on James's arm. James looked at the hand. He had stood in formation in the rain. He had stood in the heat with equipment that weighed what it weighed. He had stood in the specific silence that came before an order was given in a situation that required you to be ready for what came after. He had learned in 31 years that there was a way to respond to things that were being done to you incorrectly, and that the way was not to match the incorrectness. You held your ground. You said what was true. You required the other person to be accountable for their own position. He was 65 years old. He was a veteran of 31 years. He was a deacon at Second Baptist Church. He was a man whose wife had pressed the slacks he was wearing. He said, "Remove your hand." He said it quietly. He said it the way he said things when the meaning was not negotiable. He had learned that register in year 2 at Parris Island. He had learned that you did not shout to communicate gravity. You lowered your voice. You slowed your cadence. You made every word carry more weight than the word before it. The register worked in training situations, and it worked in command situations, and it worked in situations that had nothing to do with the military, but required the same principle. It worked now. Hutchins did not remove it immediately. He said, "Sir, I need you to cooperate." James removed his arm from Hutchins' grip in the specific controlled way that 31 years had built into his body. He said, "I am cooperating. I am standing in this line and I am waiting for my prescriptions. I have not taken anything. My name is James Elwood Carter, and I'm a patient of this pharmacy." Hutchins reached for the radio on his belt. He called for backup. He said, "I have a situation at the pharmacy counter. Uncooperative subject. Need support." A second officer appeared from the front of the store. His name was Officer Gaines. He was 26 years old and had been in the position for 7 months. He came over and looked at the situation and looked at James, and he made a decision that went the same direction Hutchins had gone. He said, "Sir, we need you to come with us." James said, "I'm going to stand here and wait for my prescriptions." Gaines said, "Sir." He reached for James's arm. James said, "You need to call Denise Holloway at that counter. She will tell you who I am and why I am standing here." Neither officer called Denise Holloway. Denise had been watching. She had been watching since Hutchins first walked over. She had finished the prescriptions at 3:40. James's name was cued to call. She had been about to call it when she saw Hutchins approach from the far aisle. She watched the first exchange. She watched James produce his ID and Hutchins wave it off. She watched Gaines come over. She had been at Millbrook 9 years, and she knew the difference between a customer situation that was ambiguous and one that was not. James Carter, standing in the pharmacy line, was not ambiguous. She had watched him come in twice before and do the same thing he was doing now. She had his prescription ready. She had his history in the system. She knew who he was. She knew that Hutchins did not know who he was and that Hutchins was not trying to find out. She watched for 90 seconds. Then she came out from behind the counter. She said, "James." James looked at her. He said, "Denise." She turned to Hutchins. She said, "What is happening?" Hutchins said, "We have a situation here with this individual." Denise said, "This individual is James Carter. He is a patient of this pharmacy. I have his prescriptions right here. He has been in my line for 12 minutes. He has not taken anything from this store. What are you doing?" Hutchins said, "We received a report." Denise said, "From who?" He did not answer. He said, "There were reports of merchandise." She said, "James, were you in any other part of this store today?" James said, "I came straight from the main entrance to this counter." She said, "The camera above this counter has been recording since before you walked in. I have his entire visit on camera. He walked in. He got in line. He has been standing in this line, that's all." Hutchins said, "The footage will need to be." Denise said, "The footage shows exactly what I just told you. Are you going to listen to me, or are you going to keep?" She stopped. She said it differently. She said, "What do you need in order to let this man get his prescriptions and go home?" Hutchins said, "Protocol requires." Denise said, "James, do you have your ID?" James produced his wallet. He had his driver's license. He also had his veteran's ID card. He had 2 forms of identification. His name was on both. His photograph was on both. Gaines looked at both. He said, "Thank you." He said it in the way that was supposed to suggest the situation was resolved. He did not move. He did not say they were free to go. He stood there. James looked at Gaines. He said, "Am I being detained?" Gaines said, "We just need to verify." James said, "I have given you my identification. The pharmacist has confirmed who I am. The camera shows my entire visit. Am I being detained?" Gaines said, "Sir." Hutchins said, "We need to follow up on the initial report." James said, "What report?" Neither officer answered. James looked at them. He said, "I am going to wait here until you answer that question or release me." He stood still. He put his hands at his sides. He looked at a fixed point above and behind Hutchins' head. He had learned in the Marines that there was a specific place to look when you were waiting. Not at the person, not away, above and behind. It communicated neither aggression nor submission. It communicated, "I am here and I will continue to be here, and you are going to have to resolve this." He had taught this to junior Marines. He was applying it now. He thought about Preston going back to the mill. He thought about Louise coaching the girl who had decided she couldn't. He thought about Mattie pressing the slacks. He thought, "We don't leave. We don't fold. We wait and we say what is true, and we make the other person be accountable for what they are doing." He waited. He was a man who knew how to wait. There was a man at the end of the pharmacy aisle named Raymond Cole. Raymond Cole was 73 years old. He had grown up on Sycamore Street, 2 houses from James Carter's family. He had been a year behind James in school. He had watched James leave for the Marines when they were both teenagers, and he had watched James come back 31 years later, and he had been at Mattie's funeral, and he had been at every church picnic and every Grayfield 4th of July parade where James walked with the veterans group. He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had a basket in his hand. He stood at the end of the aisle and watched what was happening. Then he set down his basket. He walked to the pharmacy section. He said, "James." James said, "Raymond." Raymond looked at the 2 officers. He said, "I have known this man since we were 9 years old. His name is James Elwood Carter. His father's name was Preston Carter. His mother's name was Louise Carter. He went to Grayfield Elementary and Grayfield High, and he joined the United States Marine Corps, and he served 31 years. And he came home with 2 different commendations I know of, and he has been a deacon at Second Baptist for 12 years, and he has been filling his prescriptions at this counter for 2 years, and he has never taken a thing that wasn't his in 65 years. He said it without stopping. He said it the way a man said something when he had been holding it in for 90 seconds and had decided it needed to be said completely. Hutchins looked at Raymond. He said, "Sir, please don't interfere with." Raymond said, "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm telling you who this man is." He pulled out his phone. He said, and I am going to call Reverend Williams at Second Baptist, who is also a former city councilman, and I am going to tell him what is happening in this pharmacy right now, and you are going to have considerably more people in this aisle in the next 10 minutes. Hutchins said, sir. Raymond was already dialing. Reverend Thomas Williams had been the pastor of Second Baptist Church for 22 years. He had been a city councilman for 8 of those years before he chose the church over the council. He had made that choice deliberately, and he had never second-guessed it. He was also a veteran of the United States Army. 22 years. He had come home in 1991, and he had come to Second Baptist because his mother had been a member since before he was born, and because the Reverend at the time, a man named Reverend Morris Holloway, had looked at Thomas Williams across his desk and said, "The church needs men who know what it means to be responsible for other people. You know that. Come work with us. Come." He had come. He had become the Reverend. He and James Carter had a specific kind of understanding that had been formed the first time they sat in the same deacons' meeting and understood that they were speaking the same language. The language was not explicitly military. It was the language of people who had learned what it meant to be accountable for something larger than themselves, and who had brought that accountability into the church and the community. He received Raymond's call at 3:47. Raymond said, "You need to come to the Millbrook Pharmacy at the health center right now. They have James Carter detained and they won't let him get his prescriptions." The Reverend said, "I'll be there in 8 minutes. He was there in 7. He came through the main entrance and walked directly to the pharmacy. He was a tall man, 67 years old, wearing his collar. He said, "James." James said, "Thomas." He looked at both officers. He said, "I am Reverend Thomas Williams of Second Baptist Church. I am also a veteran of the United States Army, 22 years. The man you are detaining is Corporal James Elwood Carter, United States Marine Corps, 31 years of service, 2 commendations recipient of the United States Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal. He is also a deacon of my church and a man I have known personally for 19 years. I am asking you to release him immediately." Hutchins said, "We are still in the verification process and I need." The Reverend said, "I am the verification. I am standing here telling you who this man is. His pharmacist has told you. His neighbor has told you. The camera has shown you. What else do you need?" Hutchins said, "Company protocol requires." The Reverend said, "I would like to speak to the store manager." He said it simply. He had been speaking with people for 22 years of church, and he had learned that the simplest sentences were often the ones that moved things. Hutchins said, "The manager is." The Reverend said, "Please contact the manager right now." The manager's name was Sandra Okafor. She had been managing the Millbrook Health Center for 6 years. She had been in her office reviewing the monthly inventory report when her assistant came in and said, "You need to go to the pharmacy right now." She had gone. She had walked into the pharmacy section at 3:54, and she had looked at the situation, and she had spoken to Denise, and she had looked at the camera timestamp, and she had taken in the full picture in approximately 45 seconds. She said to Hutchins, "Did she confirm who this man is?" Hutchins said there were reports. Sandra said, "Did she confirm who this man is?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have his ID?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Does the camera show his entry?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then why are you still standing here?" She said it without moving her voice. Hutchins looked at Gaines. Gaines looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at James. She said, "Mr. Carter, I am Sandra Okafor. I am the manager of this facility. I want to tell you directly that what happened here today was wrong. Please come get your prescriptions." She looked at Hutchins and Gaines. She said, "You will both report to my office," she said, and then she turned to James. She said, "I'm deeply sorry for this." James said, "I know." He went to the counter. Denise handed him his prescriptions. She said, "I'm sorry, James." He said, "It's not your fault." She said, "I know. I'm still sorry." He said, "I know you are." He paid. He took his prescriptions. He put them in his jacket pocket. He turned. Raymond was still there. The Reverend was still there. Several other people had gathered at the end of the aisle during the preceding 12 minutes. He looked at them. He said, "Thank you." He went home. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. He thought about the 11 minutes he had been in line. He thought about Hutchins' hand on his arm. He thought about what Raymond had said, the full accounting, the names, the years, all of it said without stopping. He thought about the Reverend standing there in his collar saying, "Corporal James Elwood Carter, 31 years, 2 commendations recipient of the Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal." He thought about the way the Reverend's voice had sounded when he said it. He thought these people knew me before the pharmacy needed to know me. They knew me before any of this happened. He thought that is not the point. The point is I should not have needed them to say it. He thought about that for a while. Then he went to the sink and washed his face, and he looked out the window at the backyard, where the tomato plants were still going in the fall sun. He had planted them in April. Mattie had always grown tomatoes. He grew them now. He went inside and made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter the way he had eaten when he was on duty and the table was occupied by something else. Then he sat down. He wrote what had happened in the legal pad he kept in the kitchen drawer. He wrote the time he arrived. He wrote the time Hutchins approached. He wrote everything that was said. He wrote the time Sandra arrived and what she said. He wrote the time he left. He dated the entry. He signed it. He put the legal pad back in the drawer. He went to bed at 9:30. He lay in the bed in the room where he and Mattie had slept for 38 years. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Preston going to the mill. He thought about Louise coaching the girl who thought she couldn't. He thought about the first sergeant he had served under in year 3, a man named Sergeant First Class Theodore Briggs, who had told him once after a difficult exercise, "Carter, you don't let things that don't deserve space take up space in you. That's a discipline. You practice it the same way you practice anything else." James had practiced it for 47 years. He lay there, and he did not let the pharmacy take up space it had not earned. He thought about Amara coming Saturday. He thought about the tomatoes in the backyard that needed checking in the morning. He thought about the deacons' meeting at 8 and the finance report he needed to have ready. He was up at 5:15. He made coffee. He drank it at the kitchen table. He thought through the day. He went out to check the tomatoes. He had a deacons' committee meeting at 8. Sandra Okafor initiated the incident review the following morning. She had been in the position for 6 years. In 6 years, she had reviewed 4 loss prevention incidents involving customers. 2 had been straightforward. 1 had been ambiguous. This one was not ambiguous. She contacted the corporate loss prevention department at 8:15 in the morning. She sent the incident report she had written herself the previous evening. She sent the camera footage timestamp with the entry to exit tracking. She included Raymond Cole's written account, which she had photographed with her phone when he handed it to her. She included her own account of the conversation in her office with Hutchins and Gaines, typed and time-stamped. She sent all of it together because she had learned in 6 years that the quality of a review depended on the quality of the documentation submitted. She sent thorough documentation. The review was completed in 6 days. The reviewing officer called Sandra on day 6 and went through the findings. The camera footage showed James Carter entering the main entrance at 3:31. The footage showed him walking directly to the pharmacy counter. The footage showed him taking his place at the end of the line. The footage showed him standing without approaching any merchandise section until Hutchins walked over at 3:42. There was no footage of any other contact. There was no logged report from any customer or staff member. There was no record of any merchandise missing. The report stated the loss prevention officer initiated contact with the customer without documented cause. The customer provided valid identification and verbal confirmation of his purpose at the pharmacy counter. The customer was verbally confirmed by pharmacy staff as a current patient. The loss prevention officer proceeded with physical contact and a continued detention without cause following that confirmation. Hutchins was terminated. Gaines was placed on a 60-day probation with mandatory retraining. The corporate office sent a formal written apology to James Carter. The apology acknowledged that the loss prevention officer had acted without cause and that the company took the incident seriously. James read the apology. He read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with his coffee. He read it twice. He put it in the same folder where he kept his VA paperwork and his church committee documents, and the copy of his discharge paperwork. He put it in the folder because it was a document that had been issued and he kept documents. He had learned in 31 years of service that documents mattered. Documents were the record. The record was what you pointed to when someone asked what had happened. He had never expected to use his discharge paperwork to explain himself in a pharmacy. He kept it ready anyway. He had always kept it ready. The corporate office sent an additional letter 3 weeks after the termination. This one was a public statement sent to the Grayfield Courier. The letter said the company had completed a review of its loss prevention training procedures and had identified areas for improvement. The new protocols required loss prevention personnel to verbally confirm a customer's stated purpose at any service counter before initiating contact and required that confirmation from any service counter. Staff pharmacist, optical technician, deli staff was to be accepted as equivalent to the customer's own identification. James read the letter in the paper on a Sunday morning. He sat with it for a while. He thought, this is the part that changes something for the next person. He had been waiting for this part. He had known it would come if the people who needed to apply pressure kept applying it. The Veterans Associations had applied it. The Reverend had applied it. The courier had applied it. The letters from the men he had served with had applied it. He had applied it by writing down what happened and signing his name to it and making sure the record was accurate and complete. The record had done what records did when they were accurate and complete. It had changed something. Raymond Cole had written down what he saw. He had done it that evening in the small notebook he kept by his chair. He had always kept a notebook. His mother had told him when he was 10 years old to write down the things that happened because memory changed things and writing did not. He had been writing for 63 years. He had notebooks going back to 1961. He kept them in 2 shoeboxes on the top shelf of the closet in his study. He had written down his mother's death and his father's death and the death of 3 friends and the birth of 11 grandchildren and every job he had held and every important conversation he could remember having. He wrote down the things that mattered. He had decided that Tuesday afternoon that what was happening in the Millbrook Pharmacy mattered. He wrote down the time he arrived. He wrote down what he saw when he got there. He wrote down what he said word for word because he knew the words mattered. He wrote down what Hutchins said. He wrote down what the Reverend said. He wrote down the time Sandra Okafor arrived. He wrote down what she said. He wrote down what Denise said. He wrote down what James said when he thanked them. He wrote down the time James left. He dated the entry. He signed it. He gave a copy to Sandra for the corporate review. He gave a copy to the Reverend. He kept the original in the notebook. The notebook went in the box on the shelf with the others. Raymond Cole had been writing things down since 1961. He had been writing because his mother was right. Memory changed things. Writing did not. The Reverend used Raymond's account in the statement he gave to the Grayfield Courier the following week. He had called the Courier on Thursday morning. The reporter was a young man named Darren Osei, who had been on the county beat for 3 years. Darren had heard the initial report through a contact at the Veterans Association and had already begun making calls. The Reverend gave him 40 minutes on the phone. He gave him Raymond's account. He gave him the specific details of James's service record that James had agreed could be shared. He gave him a photograph. The photograph was from 2008. It was from the ceremony where James received his second commendation. He was in his dress blues. He was standing at attention. The look on his face was the look a person had when they understood that something mattered and they intended to be equal to it. The Courier ran the story on Thursday. The headline said, "Decorated Marine veteran detained at Grayfield Pharmacy while picking up prescriptions. Management apologizes. Loss prevention officer terminated." The story was 4 columns. Darren had done the work. He had the camera footage timestamp description from Sandra Okafor. He had Raymond's written account. He had the Reverend's statement. He had James, who had agreed to be named and had agreed to one quote. The quote was, "I served this country for 31 years. I went to that pharmacy to pick up my medication. That is all I was doing." I would like people to understand that those 2 things are true at the same time. The story was shared widely. It moved through 3 counties by Friday morning. The Veterans Association of Grayfield issued a statement. The statement said that every veteran who walked into a commercial establishment to conduct legitimate business was entitled to the same dignity and respect as any other customer, and that what had occurred in the Millbrook Pharmacy was a failure of basic human respect toward a man who had given 31 years of service to his country. The association called for the corporate office to implement mandatory training for all loss prevention personnel. The Millbrook County Veterans Post issued a second statement. Their statement was shorter. It said, "James Elwood Carter is one of ours. What was done to him was done to all of us. We expect better." 3 men James had served with sent letters to the corporate loss prevention department. One of them was the man who had been James's first sergeant, a man named Master Sergeant Gerald Webb, now retired, who lived in Pensacola, and who had a writing style that left no ambiguity about what he thought or what he expected in response. The corporate office responded to each letter individually. They sent a second apology to James. He received it on a Tuesday afternoon. He was going to the church that evening for the deacons' meeting. He brought the apology with him. He showed it to the Reverend before the meeting started. The Reverend read it. He said, "Is this what you were looking for?" James said, "It's part of it." The Reverend said, "What's the rest of it?" James thought about that. He said, "If the next veteran who walks into that pharmacy gets his prescriptions without anybody's hand on his arm, that's the rest of it." The Reverend said, "That's the right answer." James said, "It's the only answer that changes something for someone who isn't me." The Reverend said, "I'll make sure it's in the record of what we asked for." James said, "That's all I need. Keep the record. Make sure it says what we asked for." The Reverend said, "It will say exactly what we asked for." His son Marcus came over on Wednesday evening. He knocked first, which he had always done, even as an adult coming to his father's house. James opened the door. Marcus said, "I heard what happened." James said, "Sit down. You want coffee?" Marcus said, "I'm good." "Dad." James said, "Sit down, Marcus." Marcus sat. He was 38 years old and looked like his mother around the eyes. He said, "I wanted to come sooner." James said there was no need to come sooner. Marcus said, "Dad, someone put their hands on you in a pharmacy." James said, "I handled it." Marcus said, "I know you did. I read Raymond's account. I read the Reverend's statement. I know you handled it." He was quiet for a moment. He said it still shouldn't have happened. James said, "No, it shouldn't." Marcus said, "What do you need?" James said, "I have what I need. The review is done. The man is gone. I have the apologies." Marcus said, "Is that enough?" James said, "I gave the Reverend the same answer. It's a start, and the rest of it is whether the next person who comes through that pharmacy can do it without this happening." Marcus looked at him. He said, "You always do that." James said, "Do what?" He said, "Make it about the next person." James said, "That's where it belongs." Marcus was quiet again. He said, "Amara asked me about the picture." James said, "What picture?" Marcus said, "The one from the ceremony, from the paper." James said, "What did she want to know?" Marcus said, "She wanted to know if you knew she was proud of you." James was quiet. He said, "Tell her yes." Marcus said, "You could tell her yourself." James said, "She's coming Saturday." Marcus said, "I know." They sat for a while. James made coffee after all. Marcus stayed for an hour. When he left, James stood at the door for a moment and watched his son walk to the car. He thought about Preston, watching him walk to the bus the morning he left for Parris Island. He thought about the look on Preston's face that morning, which was not pride exactly, and not worry exactly, but some combination of both that he had not understood until he was a father himself. He understood it now. He went inside. His granddaughter, Amara, was 11 years old. She was James and Mattie's oldest grandchild. She had his forehead, which was what James saw when he looked at her. She had Mattie's eyes, which was what he saw when he looked at her the second time. She called him Pops. She came to his house on Saturday mornings for breakfast, which was the arrangement they had made after Mattie passed, because Amara had decided on her own that Pops should not have Saturday mornings alone. On the Saturday after the pharmacy incident, she came for breakfast. She arrived at 8:52. She was never late. He had the eggs going when she knocked. She said the eggs smell good. He said biscuits are in the oven. She sat at the kitchen table and put her elbows on it. He let her. She said, "Pops, I heard what happened at the pharmacy." He said, "Where did you hear that?" She said, "Dad told Mom and Mom told me, and then I saw the paper." He put the eggs on the plate. He said, "You saw the article." She said, "I saw your picture." He got his own plate and sat across from her. She said, "Why didn't you tell us yourself?" He said, "I didn't want to make it bigger than it was." She said, "Pops, it was already what it was." He said, "I know." She ate some egg. She said, "What did you do when he grabbed your arm?" He said, "I removed it." She said, "Just like that." He said, "Just like that." I said, "Remove your hand," and he didn't, and I removed my arm from his grip. She thought about that. She said, "Were you scared?" He thought for a moment. He said, "I was angry." She looked at him. He said, "There's a difference. Being scared means you don't know what's coming. Being angry means you know exactly what's happening, and you know it's wrong. I knew what was happening. I was angry, not scared." She said, "What did you think about?" He said, "Your great-grandmother Mattie's pressed slacks." Amara looked at the slacks. He said, "She pressed these slacks. I was standing in that pharmacy in her pressed slacks, and I thought she pressed these slacks, and that is not going away, regardless of what happens next." Amara looked at the slacks for a moment. She said, "They still look real good." He said, "She kept them good. I keep them what she made them." She ate more egg. She said, "The picture." He said, "Which picture?" She said, "The one from the ceremony, in dress blues." She was talking about the photograph that had run alongside the Courier article. The Reverend had provided it. It was a photograph from 2008. In the photograph, James Elwood Carter was in his dress blues. He was receiving his second commendation. He was standing at attention. The expression on his face was the one he had when he understood that something mattered, and he intended to be equal to it. Amara said, when I saw that picture, I felt something I don't have a word for yet. He said, what did it feel like? She said, it felt like I always knew you were my pops. And then I saw that picture, and I saw who else you were at the same time, and I wanted everyone to see it. He said, everyone doesn't need to see it. She said, but they should. He said, Amara. Knowing what a person deserves and knowing what they get are different things. That's something you're going to keep learning your whole life. The important thing is to keep deserving it, whether they see it or not, whether they know it or not. She said, is that what you did for 31 years? He said, every day. That's the job. You do what the job requires, whether anyone is watching or not, and you do it the same way either way. She said, what if it's hard? He said, then it's hard. You still do it. She said, every day. He said, every day. She looked at him for a moment. She said, I want to be like that. He said, you already are. I see it every Saturday. You show up, you sit down, you eat your eggs, and you ask your questions. You don't wait to be invited. That's the whole thing. You show up because you decided to. She said Grandma Mattie used to say that too, about showing up. He said she did. She said she was right. He said she was right about most things. She said not the elbows on the table. He said, I'll let that one go. She smiled. He smiled. The kitchen was quiet. She ate the last of the egg. She said, the biscuits are ready. He said, I can smell them. He got up and took them from the oven. He put them on the table. They ate together. The kitchen was quiet in the way it was quiet when two people were thinking about the same thing without needing to say it. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, not the dress blues, the one of him and Mattie at their 40th anniversary. He was wearing the good slacks. She was wearing the green dress. They were both laughing at something someone had said. He could not remember what. He remembered the green dress. He remembered the way she had pressed those slacks the night before. He remembered everything that mattered. The following Sunday, James arrived at Second Baptist Church at 8:45. Services started at 9. He always arrived 15 minutes early. He had always arrived 15 minutes early. It was what the deacons did. You were there before the congregation, because being there first was part of what it meant to be responsible for the place. He took his seat in the deacon's pew. He looked at the front of the sanctuary, the same sanctuary he had been coming to since he was a child, in the pew between Preston and Louise. The Reverend came out from the vestry and saw him. He walked over. He said, James. James said, Thomas. The Reverend sat beside him. He said, how are you? James said, I'm all right. He said it the way he said things that were true. The Reverend said the congregation is going to want to do something. James said they don't have to do anything. The Reverend said they know that. They want to anyway. James thought about it. He said if they want to do something, they can donate to the Veterans Food Pantry at the community center. That needs more than it gets. The Reverend said that's a good cause. James said it's a cause that feeds people who served. That's what matters. The Reverend said I'll announce it this morning. James said you don't have to say why. The Reverend said I'll just say the deacon board recommends it. James said that works. The congregation came in. James sat in the deacon's pew with his hands in his lap and the good slacks on his legs, and the corps cap set beside him on the seat. He listened to the music. He had always loved the music at Second Baptist. He had loved it since he was 8 years old. He had loved it in every place he had been stationed, wherever he could find it. He had come back to it every Sunday since he came home. The music meant the place was still here. The place was still here. He was still here. He had been coming to this sanctuary for 65 years. He had sat in the pew as a boy between Preston and Louise, and he had sat in the pew as a husband beside Mattie, and he had sat in the pew as a widower beside the memory of both of them. He had sat in the deacon's pew for 12 years. He had sat in it on Sundays when the week had been good. He had sat in it on Sundays when the week had been hard. He had sat in it on the Sunday after Mattie's funeral when he did not know how to sit anywhere at all, but he had sat there because it was where he was supposed to be. You showed up, even when it was the hardest thing, especially then. He sat in it now on the Sunday after the pharmacy. The work was still here. 31 years of service, 12 years of deacon work, Mattie's pressed slacks, Amara's yellow blanket, his father's silence when James said he had decided, his mother's voice telling a girl who thought she couldn't you already are. All of it. He had it all. He was a man who kept what mattered. He had kept it through 31 years of service. He had kept it through the deaths of his parents and his wife. He had kept it through 16 years of coming home to a town that was still his town, and still his church, and still his grandchildren's Saturday breakfasts. He had kept it through a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon when someone had put his hand on his arm, and he had looked at the hand and said, remove it, and had meant it, and had made it happen. He sat in the deacon's pew on that Sunday, and he listened to the music, and he thought about all the things that had not been taken. The Corps' cap, the good slacks, the tomatoes in the backyard, Amara's yellow blanket, Marcus saying, "I'll be there in 6 blocks," Raymond saying his name on Sycamore Street, the Reverend saying 31 years in a voice that made the whole aisle hear it, Mattie pressing the crease 3 times. All of it. He had all of it. It was the record. The record was what you pointed to when someone asked who you were. He knew who he was. He had always known. He had known it at 18 when he got on the bus to Parris Island in the good slacks his mother had pressed for the occasion. He had known it at 31 years' retirement in the dress blues with the commendation in his hand. He had known it at Mattie's funeral in the front pew of Second Baptist with his children on either side. He had known it at 3:42 on a Tuesday afternoon in a pharmacy in Grayfield when a man had put his hand on his arm. He had known it then. He knew it now. The record said who he was. He knew who he was. Subscribe our channel, we find the record, and we know who was there.